Imagine discovering that human history doesn't begin where you were taught it does. Not with the first cities, not with the invention of writing, not 6,000 years ago. Imagine discovering that all of that may only be what came after something much older, after an entire world that ended. There is a small, silent object made of clay that has been sitting inside a museum for over a century. It doesn't look impressive. It isn't a towering monument or a lost golden artifact. It doesn't draw crowds or headlines. And yet, this unassuming object makes one of the most unsettling claims ever recorded about our past. It states that before the world we know, Earth was ruled by kings for a total of 241,200 years. Not dynasties, not vague mythological ages, named kings, in specific cities, with reigns measured using precise, deliberate numbers. And then, almost without emotion, the text delivers a single sentence that divides history in two. It says that a great flood swept over the world, and after that everything changed. What makes this disturbing is not just the scale of time, it's the nature of the document itself. This is not a religious myth, not a poetic legend, not a symbolic creation story. It was written like an official record, like an administrative archive, with the same dry, factual tone used to list taxes, harvests, and royal successions. Even more unsettling is what happens next. The document doesn't end. It continues. The kings who rule after the flood reigned for decades, not tens of thousands of years. Their cities are recognizable. Some of their names appear in other archaeological records. One of them, Gilgamesh, is known to have actually existed. This creates a problem that modern history rarely likes to confront. If the later portion of this document is accepted as real history, on what basis do we dismiss the earlier part? The same scribe wrote both sections, with the same structure, the same language, the same matter-of-fact tone. At no point does the text say it has shifted from myth to reality. For decades, the solution has been simple: label the first part symbolic, exaggerated, mythological. But myths do not usually follow strict mathematical patterns, and symbols do not normally divide time into such clean before and after worlds. Perhaps the mistake is trying to answer too quickly. Perhaps the real question isn't whether these kings were gods, humans, or something else entirely. Perhaps the question is this: what if this document isn't trying to tell a story at all? What if it is preserving a memory? A fragmented recollection of a time when the world operated under different rules, when power, time, and authority followed a scale that no longer exists. A world that ended in a catastrophe so complete that everything afterward became smaller, shorter, and more fragile. Cultures across the planet tell versions of the same story: a great flood, a world before the current one, beings who ruled for impossibly long spans of time, a collapse followed by a diminished restart. These stories appear in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, the Americas, and the Bible, in cultures that never met, never shared language, never exchanged beliefs. The question is no longer whether these stories match perfectly. They don't. The question is why they share the same underlying structure. This video is not here to sell you a theory. It does not ask you to believe in anything. It examines a real, accepted, ancient document and follows its implications carefully, without rushing to conclusions. Because sometimes the most unsettling discoveries are not extraordinary revelations. They are the quiet realization that we may never have been shown the full story. If there truly was a world before ours, what exactly was lost when the waters rose? And why does it feel like something in us still remembers it? This is where the investigation begins. The object at the center of this mystery is not hidden in a forbidden vault or locked away from public view. It has been studied, catalogued, and displayed for decades, and yet its implications remain largely ignored. It is known today as the Sumerian King List. This document survives in several copies and fragments, but the most complete version is inscribed on a four-sided clay prism discovered in the early 20th century in what is now southern Iraq. It dates to around 4,000 years ago and was written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script developed by the Sumerians, the people widely credited with inventing civilization itself. At first glance, the text appears mundane. It reads like a bureaucratic record, a list of kings, their cities, the lengths of their reigns. There is no poetry, no moral lesson, no attempt to impress or persuade. This is important because Sumerian myths and epics exist elsewhere, and they sound nothing like this. Those texts are symbolic, emotional, filled with metaphor and divine drama. The King List is different. It sounds like an accountant wrote it. That alone is why historians take it seriously. The list was not created by fringe thinkers or later cultures trying to invent a glorious past. It was compiled by Sumerian scribes themselves and used to establish political legitimacy. It was meant to show who had the right to rule and where that authority came from. In other words, this document was never intended to be mysterious. It was meant to be official. And that is precisely where the discomfort begins. Because the very first line of the text makes a claim that immediately challenges everything we assume about early human history. It states that kingship did not originate with human society. It says that kingship descended from heaven. From that point on, the document lists the earliest rulers of Earth, beginning in the city of Eridu, which archaeology confirms is one of the oldest urban settlements ever discovered. The problem is not the cities. The problem is the numbers. The first kings are said to have ruled for tens of thousands of years each, not collectively, individually. The list carefully names them, moves the seat of power from city to city, and then adds up their reigns with exact precision. 8 kings, 5 cities, a total of 241,200 years. There is no commentary, no explanation, no hint that this should be read symbolically. Then, without warning, the list stops. It does not fade out. It does not transition into myth. It simply states that a great flood swept over the land. And after that single sentence, everything changes. The kings who come next rule for centuries, not millennia, then decades, then spans of time that fit comfortably within what we know of human biology. What makes this impossible to dismiss is not just the absurdity of the early numbers. It is the continuity of the document. The same list that records the impossible reigns also records kings we know were real, kings whose cities have been excavated, kings whose names appear in other historical texts. There is no dividing line in the language. No signal that the author believed the earlier section was fictional and the later section was factual. To the scribe who carved these symbols into clay, it was all history. And that leaves us with a problem that has never been fully resolved. If this document was trusted enough to legitimize real kings, why was its opening section preserved at all? Why record something so outrageous if it was never meant to be taken seriously? And more importantly, what forced ancient historians to place a single catastrophic event between two radically different worlds? Because whatever happened at that dividing line did more than destroy cities. It seems to have rewritten the rules of reality itself. To understand why the Sumerian King List is so unsettling, we need to focus on what it says about the world before the flood. Not the interpretations, not the theories, the raw structure of the record itself. According to the list, the earliest phase of human history operated under completely different rules. Power did not change hands frequently. Time did not move at a human scale. Kings did not rise and fall within a single lifetime. They ruled for spans of time so long that entire civilizations could rise, collapse, and vanish beneath a single reign. This is not presented as chaos or tyranny. It is presented as stability. The text describes a world where kingship remained fixed in one city for tens of thousands of years before being transferred to another. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Each relocation is recorded calmly, as if the movement of authority followed an organized plan rather than the violent upheavals we associate with ancient power struggles. This suggests something important. The pre-flood world described in the list was not primitive. It was structured. The kings are not portrayed as conquerors or warlords. They are administrators. custodians of a system that already existed when they took power. What makes this even stranger is the absence of heroic storytelling. There are no battles, no enemies, no expansion narratives. For nearly 250,000 years, the list describes a world without recorded wars, revolutions, or political collapse. Only continuity. This runs directly against the model we are taught, where early societies are fragile, unstable, and constantly threatened by famine, violence, and environmental pressure. The pre-flood world in the King List appears to have solved problems we still struggle with today: governance, succession, social order. And then it ends. Not gradually, not with decline, with a single sentence. Then the flood swept over. The text does not explain why. It does not assign blame. It does not describe divine punishment or moral failure. It simply treats the flood as a boundary, a reset. Everything before it belongs to one category of existence. Everything after belongs to another. This abrupt transition suggests that the flood was not just a natural disaster within an ongoing civilization. It was a termination event. After the flood, the world is recognizable to us. Kings rule for human lifespans. Cities grow, collapse, and rebuild. Conflict becomes visible. History becomes messy. Before the flood, none of that appears. The implication is subtle but profound. The Sumerian scribes believed that humanity did not slowly evolve into its current state. They believed it fell into it. Something was lost. The King List does not mourn this loss. It does not celebrate it either. It records it. And that may be the most chilling part, because records are usually written by survivors, and survivors remember what no longer exists. The question is not whether the flood happened. Ancient cultures across the world remember it. The question is, what kind of world had to exist for its destruction to mark such a clear and irreversible turning point? And why every attempt to explain that earlier world seems to make modern historians deeply uncomfortable. The strongest reason the Sumerian King List refuses to fade into myth is what happens after the flood. This is where the document becomes impossible to ignore. Once the waters recede, the list resumes its account as if nothing extraordinary has happened. Kingship continues, cities are named, reigns are recorded. But now, the numbers change. The reigns collapse from tens of thousands of years to spans that, while still long, exist within the outer limits of human possibility. Centuries instead of millennia. Eventually, decades. And among these post-flood kings appears a name that anchors the entire document to reality: Gilgamesh. Unlike the shadowy rulers of the earlier age, Gilgamesh is not confined to a single list. He appears in epic poetry, royal inscriptions, and archaeological records. The city he ruled, Uruk, has been excavated. Its massive walls still exist. This matters more than any theory, because it means the list is not a purely mythological creation. It records at least some rulers who undeniably lived and governed real cities. And that creates a paradox. If the later portion of the document is historically grounded, then the earlier portion cannot be dismissed casually. The same scribal tradition produced both sections, the same tone, the same structure, the same method of record-keeping. There is no editorial break, no disclaimer, no indication that the writer believed the first kings were fictional and the later kings were real. To the people who compiled this list, history did not begin after the flood. It continued. This forces us into an uncomfortable position. Either the scribes preserved stories they believed to be true, even if those stories no longer made sense in their own time, or they deliberately fabricated a past so extreme that it undermines the credibility of their present. The second option makes little sense. Political propaganda usually exaggerates continuity, not impossibility. It seeks legitimacy through familiarity, not through claims that defy biological limits, which leaves the first option. That the pre-flood section of the list was inherited, passed down, preserved because it mattered, even if it could no longer be explained. This is how memory survives catastrophes. Details are lost, Context disappears, but structure remains. The King List does not try to explain how such long reigns were possible. It simply records that they were. And when something that should not exist appears inside an otherwise sober historical document, it raises a question more troubling than any speculation about gods or aliens. What kind of event erases not just cities, but the very conditions under which those earlier rulers existed? Because after the flood, the world does not just reset politically. It resets biologically, socially, structurally. Human history shrinks, and the King List quietly preserves the memory of a time before that shrinkage occurred. A time that looks less like myth the longer you refuse to ignore it. If the reigns recorded in the Sumerian King List were simply exaggerations, we would expect them to be chaotic, random, inconsistent. They are not. When scholars examined the numbers closely, they noticed something deeply unsettling. The lengths of the pre-flood reigns follow a strict mathematical structure. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system. Not base 10 like ours, base 60. We still live with the legacy of this system today. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This was not primitive math. It was sophisticated, deliberate, and precise. Within this system, the Sumerians measured large spans of time using a unit called the sar, equal to 3,600 years. When the reigns of the earliest kings are expressed in this unit, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. 28,800 years is exactly 8 sar. 36,000 years is exactly 10 sar. 43,200 years is exactly 12 sar. These are not approximations. They are perfect multiples. This is not how myths are constructed. Storytellers inflate numbers to impress. They do not encode them with mathematical symmetry across multiple generations of rulers. Someone calculated these figures. That does not mean they represent literal human lifespans, but it does mean they represent something intentional, which raises an uncomfortable question. If these numbers are symbolic, what exactly do they symbolize? They are tied to named individuals, to specific cities, to a chronological order. Symbolic eras are usually abstract. These are administrative. This suggests that the scribes were not inventing numbers. They were translating something into a system they understood. And that brings us to the phrase that opens the entire list. Kingship descended from heaven. For modern readers, this sounds poetic, metaphorical, religious. But for the Sumerians, kingship was not a human invention. It was a received institution. Authority did not rise from the people. It arrived from somewhere else. Whether that somewhere was divine, cosmic, or symbolic is still debated. But the structure of the King List treats it as an external input, not an internal evolution. Civilization did not invent its operating system. It was installed. This flips the traditional story of human development upside down. Instead of societies gradually organizing themselves, the King List suggests that organization came first and society formed around it. That idea is not limited to Sumer. The divine right of kings, mandates of heaven, God-chosen rulers. These concepts appear again and again across ancient cultures. But Sumer places them at the very beginning, not as mythology, as history. And once you see the mathematical order beneath the reigns, it becomes harder to dismiss the entire document as fantasy, because myths inspire belief, records preserve structure, and this structure points towards something the King List never explains directly. It implies that the early rulers were operating on a scale of time that no longer applies to the world we inhabit. Which leads to the next question. If these reigns were not measured in human years as we experience them today, then whose calendar was being used? To understand what kind of time the Sumerian King List may be recording, we need to stop thinking like modern humans. Our sense of time is biological. We measure years by aging bodies, generations by birth and death. But the King List is not written from that perspective. It describes a world where continuity mattered more than lifespan, where stability was the defining feature of power. Imagine a ruler who does not age, a ruler whose presence remains unchanged while thousands of human generations live and die beneath him. To the people living under such a ruler, time itself would feel different. History would not be divided by dynasties. It would be divided by events. And the King List reflects exactly that. There is only one true break in the entire document. Not a war, not a rebellion, not a collapse of empire, a flood. Everything before it belongs to one category. Everything after it belongs to another. This is not how symbolic mythology usually works. It is how technical records define system resets. Before the flood, reigns are counted in tens of thousands of years. After the flood, time contracts dramatically. Suddenly, rulers reign for centuries, then decades, then lifetimes we recognize as human. It is as if the system itself changed, not just politically, biologically. This same pattern appears in another place most people overlook: the early chapters of the Bible. Before the flood, figures like Methuselah lived for nearly 1,000 years. After the flood, lifespans fall sharply. By the time of later biblical kings, human life has a clear upper limit. Two separate traditions, different cultures, same structural break. Something happened that altered the rules. The Sumerian King List does not explain why. It does not justify it. It simply records it, and that is what makes it dangerous to dismiss. Because myth explains, records observe, which raises a critical question. If the pre-flood rulers were operating under a different relationship to time, then the numbers in the King List may not be exaggerations at all. They may be measurements taken from a framework we no longer share. A framework where a year does not equal an Earth year as we experience it today. Where authority is measured in cycles, not lifetimes. Where rulers are not temporary. This idea becomes even more unsettling when we look at what happens after the flood. The list resumes without hesitation. Same tone, same structure, same administrative voice. The scribe does not say, "Now the myths end." He does not say, "From here on, history begins." He treats both eras as equally real, which means, from the Sumerian perspective, the flood did not separate myth from history. It separated two different kinds of world. And that brings us to the figure who connects them. A king who appears on both sides of the divide. A ruler whose existence is confirmed by archaeology, literature, and physical ruins. A king whose story forces us to confront the possibility that the line between gods and humans was never as clean as we think. His name was Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is the most dangerous name in the Sumerian King List, because Gilgamesh is real, not mythological real, not symbolic real, historically real. The ruins of his city, Uruk, still exist. Its massive defensive walls were physically excavated. His name appears in multiple independent inscriptions, and yet the King List describes him in a way that should be impossible. It calls him divine, 2/3 God, 1/3 man, and it assigns him a reign of 126 years, not thousands, not symbolic cycles. A number that sits uncomfortably between myth and biology. Gilgamesh stands exactly where the world changes. He is not part of the age of impossibly long-lived rulers, but he is not fully human either. He is the bridge. The King List treats him the same way it treats the antediluvian kings. Same tone, same administrative certainty, which means the scribes who recorded his reign did not see a contradiction. To them, Gilgamesh belonged to a lineage that predated the flood, even though he ruled after it. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. Because Gilgamesh himself was obsessed with one thing: immortality. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature on Earth, his greatest fear was death. Not metaphorical death, literal extinction. When his closest companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh breaks. For the first time, a king realizes that power, conquest, and divinity are meaningless if time still wins. So he goes looking for someone who escaped it, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, the man who lived in the world before the reset. And when Gilgamesh finally finds him, something extraordinary happens. Utnapishtim confirms everything. The flood was real, the gods were real, the old world existed, and immortality was once possible, but it is no longer allowed. Gilgamesh is told the truth no ruler wants to hear. That era is over. The door is closed. The system has changed. Even someone with divine blood cannot cross back. This moment is crucial, because it confirms that the Mesopotamians themselves believed there was a fundamental rupture in reality. Not just a disaster, a rule change. Before the flood, beings walked the earth who were not bound by human limits. After the flood, even semi-divine kings were subject to death. Gilgamesh returns home defeated, not because he failed as a king, but because he failed to reclaim something humanity had lost: longevity, continuity, proximity to the gods. This is why Gilgamesh matters more than any other name on the list. He anchors the impossible to the verifiable. If Gilgamesh is real, then the document that records him cannot be dismissed as pure myth. And if the same document treats the pre-flood kings as historical figures, then we are forced into an uncomfortable position. Either the scribes were completely incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality, or they were recording something we no longer understand. And this brings us to a pattern that appears far beyond Sumer. Because Gilgamesh is not unique. Across cultures, the same structure repeats: a golden age of long life, a catastrophic reset, a diminished human world. Which raises a question that cannot be ignored. What if the Sumerian King List is not exaggerating the past? What if it is remembering it? And what if those memories did not originate on Earth? The Sumerian King List does not stand alone. If it did, it would be easy to dismiss it as a local myth, an isolated cultural fantasy from early Mesopotamia. But it isn't. The same pattern appears again and again, across continents, across civilizations that had no contact with one another. A world before the flood, beings who lived far longer than modern humans. A catastrophic reset, a sharp reduction in lifespan afterward. This is not coincidence, it is structure. In the Hebrew Bible, the patriarchs before the flood lived for centuries. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Methuselah, nearly 1,000 years of life. Then the flood comes, and immediately afterward, lifespans collapse. God explicitly states that human longevity will be limited. The rule changes. In Egypt, ancient king lists begin with dynasties of gods and demigods who ruled for thousands of years before the first mortal pharaohs appear. In India, the earliest age, the Satya Yuga, is described as a golden era where humans lived for tens of thousands of years, sometimes longer. Each successive age is shorter, weaker, more fragmented. In China, the earliest emperors are remembered as semi-divine sage kings who lived far longer than ordinary men and brought civilization fully formed. In Greece, the age of the Titans comes before the age of humans. In Mesoamerica, civilizations speak of previous worlds destroyed by water, fire, or skyborne disasters, each followed by a new, lesser humanity. The details change. The structure does not. Everywhere, the story begins the same way. An earlier world, more powerful beings, longer life, direct contact with higher intelligences. Then something happens, and afterward, humanity is diminished. This is the detail modern explanations struggle with. Why would dozens of cultures independently invent the same sequence? Not just floods, but resets. Not just gods, but rulers. Not just destruction, but biological limitation. The Sumerian King List is unique because it refuses to mythologize this memory. It bureaucratizes it. Names, cities, durations, totals. It reads like administration, not poetry. And that is what makes it dangerous. Because if the Sumerians were preserving a memory rather than inventing a story, then mythology itself changes meaning. Myths stop being fantasies. They become corrupted data, fragmented records of a world that no longer exists, passed down orally, reshaped by time, but anchored to a real event. In this framework, gods are not supernatural. They are pre-human authorities, advanced beings remembered as divine because no other category existed to describe them. The flood is not punishment. It is a filter, a planetary event that erased a previous order and forced a biological, social, and psychological reset. This explains something else that is rarely discussed. Why humanity seems haunted by loss. Why every civilization dreams of a golden age. Why religion is built around separation from the divine. Why immortality is treated as something that was taken, not something that never existed. If this pattern is real, then humanity did not slowly evolve upward. It fell and rebuilt from fragments. The Sumerian King List may be the most intact fragment we possess, not because it tells us everything, but because it tells us just enough to be terrifying. Which leads to the most controversial question of all. If these rulers were not gods in the mystical sense, then what were they? And where did they come from? At this point, there is no neutral position left. The Sumerian King List forces a choice. Either it is the most elaborate and persistent illusion ever constructed by the human mind, replicated independently across civilizations with terrifying precision, or it is a distorted memory of something that actually happened. If it is memory, then the rulers described before the flood were not symbolic. They were real. And that leads to the final question the text quietly leaves behind. If beings ruled Earth for hundreds of thousands of years and then disappeared, where did they go? The flood does not describe their extinction. It describes a transition. After the waters recede, kingship returns, but it is no longer the same. The reigns are shorter. The rulers are mortal. The divine presence is gone. It is as if control was withdrawn. From this angle, the flood is not just a catastrophe. It is a withdrawal event, a moment when direct oversight ended and humanity was left to govern itself using inherited systems it barely understood. This explains why early post-flood kings are obsessed with legitimacy. They do not claim to invent power. They claim descent, from gods, from heaven, from bloodlines, because authority no longer comes from presence. It comes from memory, and memory fades. What remains is ritual, hierarchy, divine right, and myth. The operating system stays, but the administrators are gone. This also reframes the most uncomfortable possibility of all. If these beings existed, they may not be gone forever. Advanced civilizations do not abandon long-term projects casually. They observe, they wait, they intervene only when necessary. The Sumerian texts never say the Anunnaki died. They say they returned to the heavens, which raises a final, unsettling thought. If humanity was engineered, organized, and ruled in the distant past, then our history is not a story of origin. It is a story of inheritance. We did not build civilization from nothing. We inherited its bones, its hierarchies, its obsessions with power, its instinct to look upward for authority, its fear of another reset. The clay prism sitting in a museum does not shout this truth, it whispers it, across 4,000 years, across floods, empires, and religions. It asks a single question that no civilization has ever been comfortable answering. What if we are not the first owners of this world? And what if the greatest secret of ancient history is not hidden underground, but buried inside the stories we were taught to stop taking seriously? The Sumerian King List does not demand belief. It demands reconsideration. And once you do that, history never looks the same again. The Sumerian King List survives because it refuses to fit neatly into any box we try to place it in. It is not mythology in the traditional sense. It is not history in the modern academic sense. It sits uncomfortably between the two. And that is exactly why it endures. On one side of the prism, we have figures like Gilgamesh, whose existence is supported by archaeology, literature, and inscriptions. On the other, kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before a flood that supposedly reset the world. The same document, the same writing style, the same authority. To accept one half and discard the other is not analysis. It is preference. What makes this artifact dangerous is not what it claims, but what it implies. That civilization did not emerge slowly and blindly, that power structures did not arise naturally, that humanity may have inherited a system rather than invented it. It suggests that our earliest memories were not of survival, but of governance, not of chaos, but of control, not of gods watching from the sky, but rulers walking among us. The flood becomes more than a disaster. It becomes a boundary. Before it, a world of impossible longevity and direct authority. After it, a diminished humanity trying to remember who it once answered to. Whether the pre-flood kings were extraterrestrial beings, long-lived humans, symbolic dynasties, or something we no longer have the language to describe, the pattern remains unchanged across cultures. A golden age, a collapse, a reset, a loss that echoes through religion, power, and identity. That is why this story never disappears. Because it mirrors something deeply human, the sense that we arrived late, that something was taken, that the world we inherited is not the world that was first built. The Sumerian King List does not prove that gods ruled the earth, but it proves that the people who invented civilization believed without hesitation that they once had. And belief at that scale does not come from fantasy alone. It comes from memory, fragmented, distorted, but persistent. A clay prism cannot tell us who truly ruled the ancient world, but it can force us to confront a question modern history avoids. What if the story of humanity did not begin with us? And what if the greatest discovery is not finding new artifacts, but finally taking the old ones seriously? That question is why this document still matters, and why it will never stop unsettling us.